the life and remains, letters, lectures, and poems of the Reverend Robert Murray McCheyne, minister of St. Peter's Church, Dundee, by the Reverend Andrew A. Bonar, minister of the Free Church of Scotland, 7th American, from the 21st Edinburgh edition, to which is added familiar letters from the Holy Land, etc. Dated 1860. This is being read by Peter John Parisi, also known as Brian Dean. This entire book will be broken down into half-hour sections, not broken down by the regular chapters, for some are way too long. Preface to the first edition. In this memoir, very much has been preserved in Mr. McCheyne's own words as well as feelings. Still, there is a defect quite apparent. All who knew him not only saw in him a burning and a shining light, but felt also the breathing of a hidden life of God, and there is no narrative that can fully express this peculiarity of the living man. Yet, nevertheless, as I have heard the prayers of many, and have myself throughout asked the Lord to guide me with his eye, I believe he will not let this record of his servant go forth unblessed. The portrait is not as an exact likeness. It was executed after his death from a very imperfect sketch, but it will recall his form to all who knew him. It is now a year since he rested from his labors, and this memoir is a record of some of those works that followed him. March 25th, 1844. The contents of this book, first 6 chapters, are his memoirs, going up from page 7 to page 128. Then we pick up in letters. 128 is the last chapter of the memoirs, chapter 6, but it's the first page of it. Then we pick up in the section called letters. That has 61 letters quoted from page 148 to the last one picks up on 254. And then we go into the section called Specimens of his Sketches of Sermons, and we have 9 of them here from page 256. The last one starts on page 268. Other pieces already published starts on page 280, and there's quite a few, and they go to page 377. On page 378 we have the lectures. That goes up to page 453. Then we have a previous book that was called Familiar Letters, written by his father and mother. They're included, and that section starts out on page 454, and there are 25 letters that are included. The last one starts on page 555. This is the most comprehensive book I have been able to find on Robert Murray McCheyne. And again, I'm going to break this down into half-hour sections and tell you the page number I'm leaving off on. Memoirs. Chapter 1. His youth and preparation for the ministry. Quote, "Many shall rejoice at his birth, for he shall be great in the sight of the Lord." Unquote. Luke chapter 1, verse 14. In the midst of the restless activity of such a day as ours, it will be felt by ministers of Christ to be useful, in no common degree, to trace the steps of one who but lately left us, and who, during the last years of his short life, walked calmly in almost unbroken fellowship with the Father and the Son. The date of his birth was May 21st, 1813. About that time, as is now evident to us who can look back on the past, the great head had a purpose of blessing for the Church of Scotland. Eminent men of God appeared to plead the cause of Christ. The cross was lifted up boldly in the midst of church courts, which had long been ashamed of the gospel of Christ. More spirituality and deeper seriousness began a few years onward to prevail among the youth of our divinity halls. In the midst of such events, whereby the Lord was secretly preparing a rich blessing for souls in all our borders, the subject of this memoir was born. Many were to rejoice at his birth, for he was one of the blessings which were beginning to be dropped down upon Scotland, though none then knew that one was born whom hundreds would look up to as their spiritual father. The place of his birth was Edinburgh, where his parents resided. He was the youngest child of the family and was called Robert Murray, after the name of some of his kindred. From his infancy, his sweet and affectionate temper was remarked by all who knew him. His mind was quick in his attainments. He was easily taught, and the common lessons of youth and some of the peculiar endowments began early to appear. At the age of 4, while recovering from some illness, he selected as his recreation the study of the Greek alphabet, and was able to name all the letters and write them in a rude way upon a slate. A year after, he made rapid progress in the English class, and at an early period became somewhat eminent among his school fellows for his melodious voice and powers of recollection and recitation. There were at that time catechismic exercises held in the Turin Church in the interval between sermons, and some friends remember the interest often expressed in the hearers by his correct and sweet recitation of the Psalms and passages of Scripture. But as yet he knew not the Lord. He lived to himself, having no hope and without God in the world, Ephesians 2:12. In October 1821, he entered the high school, where he continued his literary studies. During the usual period of 6 years, he maintained a high place in his classes, and in the rector's class distinguished himself by eminence in geography and recitation. It was during the last year of his attendance at the high school that he first ventured on poetic composition, the subject being Greece, like living Greece, no more. The lines were characteristically chiefly by enthusiasm for liberty and the Grecian heroism, and in these days his soul had never soared to a higher region. His companions speak of him as one who had even then peculiarities that drew attention, of a light, tall form, full of ecclesiastics and vigor, ambitious yet noble in his disposition, disdaining everything like meanness or deceit. Some would have been apt to regard him as exhibiting many traits of a Christian character, but his susceptible mind had not at that time a relish for any higher joy than the refined gaieties of society, and for such pleasures as the song and dance could yield. He himself regarded these as days of ungodliness, days wherein he cherished a pure morality but lived in heart a Pharisee. I have heard him say that there was a correctness and propriety in his demeanor at times of devotion and in public worship, which some who knew not his heart were ready to put to the account of real feeling. And this experience of his own heart made him look with jealousy on the mere outward signs of devotion in dealing with souls. He had learned in his own case how much a soul awakened to a sense of guilt may have satisfaction in performing from the proud consciousness of integrity towards men, and a sentiment devotedness of mind that chastened the feelings without changing the heart. He had great delight in rural scenery. Most of his summer vacations used to be spent in Dumfriesshire, and his friends in the parish of Ruthwell and its vicinity retained a vivid remembrance of his youthful days. His poetic temperament led him to visit whatever scenes were fitted to stir the soul. At all periods of his life, also, he had a love of enterprise. During the summer months, he occasionally made excursions with his brother or some intimate friend to visit the lakes and hills of our highlands, cherishing thereby, unawares, a fondness for travel that was most useful to him in after days. In one of these excursions, a somewhat romantic occurrence befell the travelers, such as we might rather have expected to meet with in the records of his eastern journey. He and his friends had set out on foot to explore, at their leisure, Dunkeld, that's Dunkeld, in the highlands of its vicinities. They spent a day at Dunkeld, and at sunset set out again, with a view of crossing the hills at Strathardley. A dense mist spread over the hills soon after they began to climb. They pressed on, but lost the track that might have guided them safely to the glen. They knew not how to direct their steps to any dwelling. Night came on, and they had no resource but to crouch among the heath, with no other covering than the clothes they wore. They felt hungry and cold. And awakening at midnight, the awful stillness of the lonely mountains spread a strange fear over them. But drawing close together, they again lay down to rest and slept soundly, till the cry of some wild birds in the morning dawn aroused them. Entering the Edinburgh University in November 1827, he gained some prize in all the various classes he attended. In private, he studied the modern languages, and gymnastic exercises at that time gave him unbounded delight. He used his pencil with much success, and then it was with his hand was prepared for sketching the scenes of the Holy Land. He had a very considerable knowledge of music and himself sang correctly and beautifully. This too was a gift which was used to the glory of God in after days, wonderfully enlivening his secret devotions and enabling him to lead the song of praise in the congregation wherever occasion required. Poetry also was a never-failing recreation, and his taste in this department drew the attention of Professor Wilson, who adjudged him the prize in the moral philosophy class for a poem on the Covenanters. In the winter of 1831, he commenced to study in the Divinity Hall under Dr. Chalmers, Chalmers, and the study of church history under Dr. Welsh. It may be naturally asked, what led him to wish to preach salvation to his fellow sinners? Could he say, like Robert Bruce, I was first called to my grace before I obeyed my calling to the ministry? Few questions are more interesting than this, and our answer to it will open up some of the wonderful ways of Him whose path is in the great waters and whose footsteps are not known. Psalms 77:19. For the same event that awakened his soul to a true sense of sin and misery led him to the ministry. During his attendance at the literary and philosophical classes, he felt occasional impressions, none of them perhaps of much depth. There can be no doubt that he himself looked upon the death of his eldest brother, David, as the event which awoke him from the sleep of nature and brought in the first beam of divine light into his soul. By that providence, the Lord was calling one soul to enjoy the treasures of grace, while he took the other into the possession of glory. In this brother, who was his senior by 8 or 9 years, the light of divine grace shone before men with rare and seldom loveliness. His classical attainments were very high, and after the usual preliminary studies, he had been admitted writer to the signet. One distinguishing quality of his character was his sensitive truthfulness. In a moment, with the shadow flint across his brow, if any incident were related wherein there was the slightest exaggeration, or even when nothing but truth was spoken, if only the deliverer seemed to take up a false or exaggerated view, he must not merely speak the whole truth himself, but he must have the hearer also to apprehend the whole truth. He spent much of his leisure hours in attending to the younger members of the family. Tender and affectionate, his grieved look, when they vexed him by resisting his counsels, had, it is said, something in it so persuasive that it never failed in the end to prevail on those with whom his words had not succeeded. His youngest brother, at a time when he lived according to the course of this world, was the subject of many of his fervent prayers. But a deep melancholy and a great degree of the effect of bodily ailment settled down on David's soul. Many weary months did he spend in awful gloom, till the trouble of his soul wasted away his body. But the light broke in before his death. Joy from the face of a fully reconciled Father above lighted up his face, and the peace of his last days were the sweet consolation left to his afflicted friends, when 8th July 1831 he fell asleep in Jesus. The death of his brother, with all its circumstances, was used by the Holy Spirit to produce a deep impression on Robert's soul. In many respects, even in the gift of a poetic mind, there had been a congeniality between him and David. The vivacity of Robert's ever-active and lively mind was the chief point of difference. His vivacity had admirably fitted him for public life. It needed only to be chastised and solemnized, and the event that had now occurred wrought this effect. A few months before, the happy family circle had been broken up by the departure of the second brother for India in the Bengal medical service. But when, in the course of summer, David was removed from them forever, there were impressions about such as could never be effaced, at least from the mind of Robert. Naturally, of an intensely affectionate disposition, this stroke moved his whole soul. His quiet hours seemed to have been often spent in thoughts of him who was now gone to glory. There are some lines remaining in which his poetic mind has most touchingly and with uncommon vigor painted him whom he had lost, lines all the more interesting because the delineation of character and form which they contain cannot fail to call up to those who knew him the image of the author himself. Some time after his brother's death, he had tried to preserve the features of his well-remembered form by attempting a portrait from memory. But, throwing aside the pencil in despair, he took up the pen and poured out the fullness of his heart on painting the miniature likeness of one departed. Alas, perfect yet, another touch, and still another, and another still, till those dull lips breathe life, and yonder eye lose its lackluster hue, and be lit up with the warm glance of living feeling. No, it never can be. Ah, poor powerless art, most vaunting, yet most impotent, thou seekest to trace the thousand shades and lights that gloweth conspicuous on the blessed face of him thou fains wouldst imitate, to bind down to the fragile canvas the wild play of thought and mind, affection, which were wont to dwell in the serious eye and play around the placid mouth. Thou seekest to give again that which the burning soul, inhabiting its clay-built tenement, alone can give. To leave on cold dead matter the impress of living mind, to bind a line, a shade. Speak forth not words, but the soft intercourse, which the immortal spirit, while on earth, its tabernacles breathes from every pore, thoughts not converted into words and hopes, and fears and hidden joys and griefs unborn, into the world of sound, but beaming forth, and that expression which no words or work of cunning artist can express, in vain. Alas, in vain. Come hither, painter, come. Take up once more thine instructions, thy brush, and palette, if thy haughty art be, as thou sayest, omnipotent, and if thy hand can dare to weld creative power, renew thy toil. And let my memory vivify by love, which death's cold separation has but warmed, and render sacred, dictate to thy skill, and guide thy pencil from the zittered hair. Take off that gaudy luster that but mocks the true original, and let the dry, soft, gentle, turning mots appear instead. What though into fashion garnished eye they seem, untutored and ungainly still to me. That folly floppish hair gear, lovelier far, are they because, bespeaking mental toil, labor arsidious to the golden days, golden if so improved, of guileless youth, unweary mining in the precious stores of classic lore, and better, nobler still. In God's own holy writ, this scatter here, and there a thread of grey to mark the grief that prematurely checked the bounding flow of the warm current in his veins, and shed an early twilight over so bright a dawn. No wrinkle sets upon that brow, and thus it ever was. The anger, strife, and cares of a vicarious miser did not leave their base memorial on so fair a page. The eyebrows next draw closer down, and throw a softening shade over the mild orbs below. Let the full eyelid drooping half concealed, the back retiring eye, and point to earth. The long brown lashes that bespeak a soul, like him who said, I am not worthy, Lord. From underneath these lowly turning lids, let not shine forth the gaily sparkling light, which dazzle often and often deceives, nor yet the dull, unmeaning luster that can gaze alike on all the world and pain an eye, in whose half-hidden, steady light I read a truth-inquiring mind, a fancy too, that could array in such sweet poetic garb the truth he found, while on his artless harp he touched the gentlest feelings, which the blaze of winter's hearth warms in the homely heart. And oh, recall the look of faith sincere, with which that eye would scrutinize the page, that tells us of offended God appeased by awful sacrifice upon the cross, of Calvary that bids us leave a world immersed in darkness and in death, and seek a better country. Ah, how often that eye would turn on me with pity tenderest look, and only half upbraiding bid me flee from the vain idols of my boyish heart. Nothing could more fully prove the deep impression which the event made than these verses. But it was not a transient regret, nor was it the sorrow of the world. He was in his 18th year when his brother died, And if this was not the year of his new birth, at least it was the year when the first streaks of dawn appeared in his soul. From that day forward, his friends observed a change. His poetry was pervaded with serious thought, and all his pursuits began to be followed out in another spirit. He engaged in the labors of a Sabbath school and began to seek God to his soul, to the diligent reading of the Word and attendance on a faithful ministry. How important this period of his life appeared in his own view may be gathered from his allusions to it in later days. A year after, he writes in his diary, "On this morning last year came the first overwhelming blow to my worldliness. How blessed to me, thou, O God, only knowest, who hath made it so." Every year he marked this day as one to be remembered, and occasionally its recollections seem to have come in like a flood. In a letter to a friend, 8th July, 1842, upon a matter entirely local, he concludes by a postscript, "This day, 11 years ago, my holy brother David entered into his rest, aged 26. And on that same day, writing a note to one of his flocks in Dundee, who had asked him to furnish a prefix to a work printed 1740, Letters on Spiritual Subjects, he commends the book and adds, 'Pray for me that I may be holier and wiser, less like myself and more like my heavenly Master, that I may not regress my life, if so be I may finish my course with joy. This day, 11 years ago, I lost my loved and loving brother and began to seek a brother who cannot die.'" It was to companions who could sympathize in his feelings that he embosomed himself. At that period, it was not common for inquiring souls to carry their case to the pastor. A conventional reserve upon these subjects prevailed even among lively believers. It almost seemed as if they were ashamed of the Son of Man. This reserve appeared to him very sinful, and he felt it to be so great an evil that in after days he was careful to encourage anxious souls to converse with him freely. The nature of his experience, however, we have some means of knowing. On one occasion, a few of us who had studied together were reviewing the Lord's dealings with our souls and how he had brought us to himself, all very nearly at the same time, though without any special instrumentality. He stated that there was nothing sudden in his case, and that he was led to Christ through deep and ever-abiding, but not awful and distracting convictions. In this we see the Lord's sovereignty in bringing a soul to the Savior. The Holy Spirit invariably leads it to a very deep consciousness of sin, but then he causes this consciousness of sin to be more distressing and intolerable to some than to others. But in one point does the experience of all believing sinners agree in this matter, viz., their soul presented to their view nothing but an abyss of sin, when the grace of God that bringeth salvation appeared. The Holy Spirit carried on his work in the subject of his memoirs by continuing to deepen in him the conviction of his ungodliness and the pollution of his whole nature. And all his life long he viewed his original sin, not as an excuse for his entire actual sin, but as an aggravation of them all. In this view, he was of the mind of David, taught by the unerring Spirit of truth. See Psalms 51, verse 4 and 5. At first the light dawned slowly, so slowly that, for a considerable time, he still relished an occasional plunge into the scenes of gaiety. Even after entering the Divinity Hall, he could be persuaded to indulge in lighter pursuits, at least during the first 2 years of his attendance. But it was with growing alarm. When hurried away by such worldly joys, I find him writing thus: September 14th, may there be a few such records as this in my biography. Then, December 9th, a thorn in my side, much torment. As the unholiness of his pleasures became more apparent, he writes, March 10th, 1832, I hope never to play cards again. March 25th, never visit on a Sunday evening again. April 10th, absence myself from the dance, upbraiding ill to bear, but I must try to bear the cross. It seems to be in reference to the receding tide, which thus for a season repeatedly drew him back to the world, that on July 8, 1836, he records, This morning 5 years ago, my dear brother David died, and my heart for the first time knew true bereavement. Truly, it was all well. Let me be dumb, for thou didst it, and it was good for me that I was afflicted. I know not that any providence was ever more abused by man than that was by me. And yet, Lord, what mountains thou comest over, none was ever more blessed to me. To us who can look at the results, it appears probable that the Lord permitted him thus to try many broken cisters and to taste the wormwood of many earthly streams, in order that in after days, by the side of the fountain of living water, he might point to the world he had forever loved and testify the surpassing preciousness of what he had now found. Mr. Alexander Somerville, afterwards minister of Anderston Church, Glasgow, was his familiar friend and companion in the gay scenes of his youth, and he too, about this time, having been brought to taste the powers of the world to come, they united their efforts for each other's welfare. They met together for the study of the Bible and used to exercise themselves in the Septuagint Greek and the Hebrew original. But oftener still they met for prayer and solemn converse, and carrying on all their studies in the same spirit, watched each other's steps in the narrow way. He thought himself much profited at this period by investigating the subject of election and free grace of God, but it was the reading of the Sum of Saving Knowledge, generally appendixed to our Confession of Faith, that brought him to a clear understanding of the way of acceptance with God. Those who are acquainted with its admirable statements of truth will see how well fitted it was to direct an inquiring soul. To find him some years afterwards recording, March the 11th, 1834, read in the Sum of Saving Knowledge, the work which I think first of all wrought a saving change in me. How gladly would I renew the reading of it, if that change might be carried on to perfection. It was to be observed that he never reckoned his soul saved, notwithstanding all his convictions and views of sin, until he really went into the holiest of all on the warrant of the Redeemer's work. For assuredly a sinner is still under wrath, until he have actually availed himself of the way to the Father opened up by Jesus. All his knowledge of his sinfulness and all his sad feeling of his own need and danger cannot place him one step farther off from the lake of fire. It is he that comes to Christ that is saved. Before this period he had received a bias towards the ministry from his brother David, who used to speak of the ministry as the most blessed work on earth, and often expressed the greatest delight and hope that his younger brother might one day become a minister of Christ. And now, with altered views, with an eye that could gaze on heaven and hell, and a heart that felt love, the love of a reconciled God, he sought to become a herald of salvation. He had begun to keep a register of his studies in the manner in which his time slipped away, some months before his brother's death. For a considerable time this register contains almost nothing but the bare indications of a diary, and on the Sabbath the text of the sermons he had heard. There is one gleam of serious thought, but it is the only one during that period. On occasion of Dr. Andrew Thompson's funeral, he records the deep and universal grief that pervaded the town, and then subjoins, pleasing to see so much public feeling excited on the decease of so worthy a man. How much are the times changed within these 18 centuries since the time when Joseph besought the body in secret, and when he and Nicodemus were the only ones found to bear the body to the tomb. It is in the end of the year that evidences of a change appeared. From that period and ever onward, his dry register of everyday incidences is varied with such passages as the following. November 12th, reading H. Martin's Memoirs. Would I could imitate him, giving up father, mother, country, house, health, life, all for Christ. And yet what hinders? Lord, purify me and give me strength to dedicate myself, my all, to Thee. December 4th, reading Lay Richmond's Life. Deep penitence, not unmixed with tears. I never before saw myself so vile, so useless, so poor, and above all so ungrateful. May these tears be the pledges of my self-dedication. There is frequently at this period a sentence in Latin occurring like the above in the midst of other matters, apparently with the view of giving freer expression to his feelings regarding himself. December 9th, heard a street preacher, foreign voice, seems really in earnest. He quoted the striking passage, "The Spirit and the bride say, Come, and let him that hears say, Come." From this he seems to derive his authority. Let me learn from this man to be in earnest for the truth, and to despise the scoffing of the world. April 18th. After spending an evening too lightly, he writes, My heart must break off from all these things. What right have I to steal and abuse my master's time? Redeem it, he is crying to me. December 25th. My mind not yet calmly fixed on the rock of ages. January 12, 1832. My heart has not peace. Why? Sin lieth at the door. January 25th, a lovely day. 84 cases of cholera and Muzzlenburg. How it creeps nearer and nearer like a snake. Who will be the first victim here? Let thine everlasting arms be around us, and we shall be safe. January 29th, Sabbath. Afternoon, heard Mr. Bruce, the minister of the New North Church, Edinburgh, on Malachi 1:1-6. It constitutes the very gravamen of the charge against the unrenewed man, that he has affection for his earthly parents, and reverence for his earthly master, but none for God. Most noble discourse. February 2nd, not a trait worth remembering, and yet these 24 hours must be accounted for. February 5th, Sabbath. In the afternoon, having heard the late Mr. Martin of St. George's, footnote, he says of him on another occasion, June 8, 1834, a man greatly beloved, of whom the world was not worthy, an apostolic man. His own calm, deep holiness resembled in many respects Mr. Martin's daily walk. End of the footnote. He writes on returning home, "Oh, how humble, yet how diligent, how lowly, yet how watchful, how prayerful night and day it becomes me to be, when I see such men. Help Father, Son, and Spirit." From this date he seems to have sat, along with his friend Mr. Somerville, almost entirely under Mr. Bruce's ministry. He took copious notes of his lectures and sermons, which still remain among his papers. February 28th, sober conversation. Fain would I turn to the most interesting of all subjects, cowardly backwardness. For whosoever is ashamed of me and my words, etc. Leaving off on page 18 in the middle of the page, picking up on March 6th.